All right. Well, I am super excited to chat with my guest today, Katie Wells, who is known also as the Wellness Mama. And so I'm going to dive into Katie's impressive bio, and then we're going to be talking about plastic alternatives, cookware, talking about personal products. So it's going to be, I think, a very valuable episode that applies to pretty much anybody listening to this. So without further ado, let's get into Katie's bio here. So again, Katie, the Wellness Mama, is a mom of six, as well as an award-winning blogger, author, podcaster, and real food crusader. Her mission with wellnessmama.com is to provide simple answers for healthier families through practical tips, real food recipes, natural beauty and cleaning tutorials, natural remedies, and more. And as a mom of six, Katie has developed systems and tips for living a wellness lifestyle with the family and on a budget. And she was named by greatest.com as one of the 100 most influential people in health and wellness, along with Dr. Oz, Dr. Mercola, Food Babe, and Tim Ferriss. And she writes once again at wellnessmama.com and can be found on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. She's also the creator behind Wellness, which is the first line of commercially available personal care products based on the DIY creations she had been making in her kitchen for years. And her popular Wellness Mama podcast can be found at wellnessmama.fm. And thank you so much for joining us, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, same here. So if we could just dive into your background a little bit and your wellness before we started this, I believe you said your Wellness Mama podcast started in 2014. So it's been quite almost 10 years that it's been out. And so how did you start you? What motivated you to start the Wellness Mama podcast and as well as your website?
Yeah, well, I think the website started first, and two things sort of lined up perfectly after I had my first son. And looking back, it's easy to look back and see. For instance, I tell people now if you want to create autoimmune disease, all you have to do is be really stressed out, eat a terrible diet, and not get enough sleep all throughout college, which is pretty much what I did. But I was doing okay until I got pregnant with my first child. And postpartum, I started having some really weird symptoms. And my background up to that point was actually in journalism, which is what I went to school for. And that's what I had been working in until I had him. And so I was having these weird symptoms myself. And then sitting in my 6-week follow-up appointment with my doctor, I read in Time magazine that for the first time in 2 centuries, the current generation of American children would have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. And this article went on to talk about the drastic rise in heart disease and diabetes and cancers and autoimmune disease. And I vowed in that moment that I wanted to help change that somehow. And I had no idea how I would do that, but that I didn't think that was good enough for my son or for anybody's child, and that we needed to figure out why this was happening and how we could change that curve that was happening so drastically and so quickly. And that lining up with my own health struggles that ended up taking about 8 years and a whole series of doctors to finally get answers about finding I had at the time Hashimoto's, which is now fully in remission. But that led to a really intense passion of researching about those topics. And I took my background in journalism and my love of reading and research and writing and started trying to find my own answers when I wasn't getting them through conventional medicine. And at the same time, trying to figure out what I could do to give my son and then eventually my other 5 children a good start and a solid foundation in life to hopefully not face those statistics that I was reading about at the time. And I've always been one to process by writing. And as I started writing, I realized there were many other women and families in similar situations. And at the time, there wasn't as much information available as there is now. I'm really grateful that so much of this information is now very mainstream. And you can even just go on social media and see people talking about things like morning sunlight or sourcing food from clean sources or avoiding a lot of the common toxins and things. This is so much more well known now than it was 15 years ago when I started. So that's been really encouraging to see. But I also very much fundamentally believe that moms are an absolute force of nature, and that when you can help moms who are making the daily food choices for their families and who are influencing the habits of their children, that you can create ripples that really can impact society at a larger level. And so that's been my passion with Wellness Mama since day one, and one that I'm extremely grateful to still get to do every day.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. And when did your website come out? Again, 2014 was the podcast, and you said the website was prior to the podcast.
Yeah, so I started writing in 2006 when he was born, and then officially got the name Wellness Mama in 2009. So it's been a mostly daily blog since then. I don't write as much as I used to now with the podcast. I podcast more than I write, but yeah, it's been very consistent since then.
Yeah, I can relate with that. I came out with my website in 2010, and my podcast not hasn't been around as long as you, but ever since coming out with a podcast, I'm definitely podcasting more than writing, and really do enjoy it because it's with the blog, it's just my perspective. Whereas with the podcast, of course, when you have guests, you're getting someone else's perspective, and they're not just learning from me.
Exactly.
So,
And yeah, and what an amazing honor to get to chat like you do with incredible people as my actual job. But I also think we're in a very cool time in history where, thanks to conversations like this and to the availability of all this information on the internet, people are, I think, really stepping into the driver's seat of their own health in a way and with understanding that hasn't always existed. And I say often on my podcast that we are each our own primary healthcare provider. And at the end of the day, we can work with amazing practitioners, but what really impacts our health are our own daily choices and habits and the inputs that we're putting into our own bodies. And so I'm really encouraged and excited to see this huge wave of people who are willing to step in and take responsibility for their own health. And I think that's where we're really going to see the best outcomes, is when we have informed patients who are well researched and who have a vested interest, of course, in their own health, working with all these amazing practitioners now that are specialized in certain areas and have really specific knowledge that can help people. And I think those are the best outcomes.
yeah, I agree. I noticed that the patients who are more compliant are those who are educated and already are familiar with things that we're going to talk about today, trying to minimize exposure to plastics and cookware. Whereas if someone it's brand new, not to say they're not open to it, but sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to get them to comply. So I agree. I think having podcasts like yours and mine's and others out there, is just going to lead to more compliance and better outcomes. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And so I want to start off by talking about plastic, and because that's I think that's where I found you first. Even though your podcast is so popular, I've been just fascinated by all the articles you have on the website when it comes to alternatives to plastic and safe cookware. So if we could start off by just, if you could tell people in your words, what are the main concerns with using plastic on a regular basis?
Yeah, like anything, I think in some ways the dose makes the poison, but we're also talking about compounds that are relatively extremely new to human interaction. These are things that did not exist at a wide scale 100 years ago even. So the last few generations are the first to really deal with plastic exposure, and we're very much still learning just how drastically that can impact not just human health but the health of our planet. And I know a lot of people talk about this and explain there's even been great documentaries on this, but just how much that plastic exposure is now far reaching throughout the entire Earth. We even know we have found plastic chemicals under 30 feet of ice in the Arctic. It's in the water and the ice in both poles at this point. So plastic has essentially sort of saturated the planet. And this, of course, has environmental impact as well, but it really impacts human health for a lot of reasons. And I think things like BPA kind of get the most airtime. That was one of the first ones that people started discovering and talking about. And it's a compound that's added to plastic to make it more durable, more bendable. So all the things that make it really convenient for packaging, which I would argue also has caused some problems. This availability of ultra processed foods at all times doesn't really line up with how humans have eaten for our entire history up until this point. But BPA was also originally given to livestock and to chickens to help them gain weight before slaughter. So we know that it has this effect. And BPA is present in a lot of the plastic compounds we interact with on a daily basis, but it causes that weight gain through a disruption of hormones. The same effect happens in humans. I do also think because we found out about BPA first and it gets the most airtime, we've also sort of not talked enough about the other compounds present in plastics. There's a whole family of bisphenols and BPS, BPF. There's a lot of them, but there's also a whole lot of other compounds beyond that. And this problem is really widespread. We know 92% of people tested had pretty high measurable levels of these compounds in their bodies. We know babies are now born with hundreds of chemicals in their cord blood. And the scary part about that is a baby in utero is really in the safest environment on earth because everything is so tightly controlled by the mother's body. So the fact that we're seeing hundreds of chemicals And these are just the ones that can pass through the placenta, because the mom's body is going to do everything in its power to get a lot of that stuff out. So this has become a really widespread problem, and a lot of these are estrogenic compounds, and I think are at least somewhat contributing. I don't think they're the only factor by any means, but I do think they're somewhat contributing to the rise in hormone-related problems we're seeing, and those often quoted statistics about men having a third of the testosterone that their grandfathers did at the same age. There's now been some really daunting reports about how even as early as 2050, we might be seeing things like total infertility in a lot of people, or sperm count of 0 in a lot of men. And part of this is these estrogenic compounds that sort of mimic hormones in the body and disrupt or replace the natural hormone processes that are happening that we literally depend on for our survival. There's also things like phthalates and all kinds of other compounds that we're interacting with through these plastics that are not just in our food packaging, but in our home environment, in literally parts of construction now are built with plastic. These are in clothing. A lot of clothing people don't realize is actually plastic. So not only are we ingesting these, maybe people have read that we consume about a credit card's worth of plastic per week on average now, but these things are sitting on our skin all day, every day. These things are connected to our food. They are in our food. They are in our water supply. So it's become a pretty widespread process, and honestly, one that I think would be a kind of an uphill battle to sort of undo, because it's so saturated our lifestyle at this point.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Yeah, the hormone disrupting effects of these plastics are well known and in the research. And then you also mentioned the other compounds. It's not just bisphenol A, but BPF, BPS. So that's the problem when someone just thinks they could use like a BPA free container, whether it's a water bottle or another source of plastic. It's just because it says BPA free doesn't mean it's completely devoid of endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Yeah, and we know that there's they call them floating islands the size of Texas in the ocean that are almost completely plastic waste that's just floating in the ocean. And then we run into additional problems with UV light breaking those down. And then you get these microparticles that get emitted, including things like DDT and PCBs that are now in the ocean. So they're in any kind of seafood food supply. They're in the water system in general. And these things are all contributing to disruption. And statistically, we are amping up our use and exposure to plastic. I think it's over 1 trillion plastic bags per year are used worldwide. Those don't break down in landfills. So these are now entering the groundwater. They will take, estimates are up to like 1,000 years to even start breaking down. And that's like 1 million plastic bags per minute and more than 3.5, I think, million tons of plastic each year. So this is like a pretty massive problem that we're facing.
Yeah, before we get into like plastic alternatives, I actually want to circle back to the water because there was actually an episode, I forgot the name of the practitioner you interviewed, but she was talking about, I think, the microplastics in fish. And so what's your perspective on that? Because it's a little bit of a catch-22 when it comes to seafood, nutrient dense, a lot of health benefits, but because of the plastics, is it something that you and your family try to minimize, or is it just one of those things where it's like, well, risk versus benefits, and the benefits of the nutrients outweigh the risks of the plastic in the seafood?
Yeah, I think that is a consideration we have to weigh. And I think also there is the very real consideration about stress, because it would be very easy to fall into a mindset of thinking everything is going to kill us at this point. And I think you'd probably echo this, that stress is also one of the more harmful things we can introduce to our environment as human animals. And so I think it's figuring out that balance of not getting to a point where everything is stressing you out and just making good choices within what's available from a budget perspective, from an availability perspective, and from a health perspective, to make the best choices possible whenever possible. And so much like with heavy metals, it seems like there's an element with plastic and seafood that you want to aim for smaller seafood, because the larger fish have eaten other fish that also had this plastic contamination. And so the higher up the food chain you go, the more exposure you're potentially getting to both plastics and heavy metals. So I'm a big fan of choosing things like sardines or small fish that have a very high nutrient density, that are also very inexpensive compared to a lot of other forms of seafood, and that are sort of like nature's multivitamin of sorts, because they also have all these minerals and calcium, and you're getting the whole fish in that sense. So I think it's good to make just easier choices that way when it comes to choosing the type of seafood. But I think also it's not that plant foods don't have their own set of problems that can come with them. And we know we need fat soluble vitamins and omega-3s and all of these compounds that are present in seafood or animal products as well. So I think it's just being aware as consumers and making the best choices that we can, and also realizing that unfortunately the reality of our time in history right now is that we are going to face these compounds in some way, just like we are going to be exposed to EMFs in some way. So how can we just apply the 80-20 rule and minimize when possible, but not in a way that's going to be a source of stress that's going to lead to health problems in other areas?
Yeah, those are good points, because you can make an excuse for not eating anything, because you're right. No matter what the food, it seems like there's a drawback. And I completely agree about, if you're going to eat fish, just try to avoid the swordfish, the king mackerel, the tuna, and stick with the smaller fish. Sardines, as you mentioned, a great source. So thank you for sharing that. And so let's dive into some of the alternatives to plastic. So for those who are like, well, what am I going to use instead of like plastic bags, those little Ziploc bags, or, the other brands and plastic free storage container storing. I listen on your podcast also. I know, like, storing meat, it sounds like is a bit of a challenge when it comes to avoiding the plastic. But if you could talk about maybe just, yeah, I mean, I talk about that as well, but especially for other sources, and then going into the grocery stores, those produce plastic bags. So what do you do in your household to minimize your exposure to plastic?
Yeah, I think there are some easy swaps in some categories that I'll talk about. I also think it's sort of the gold standard that's definitely not doable at scale for all of us, but to any degree that we can have direct relationship with where our food's coming from, whether it be growing our own food or shopping from local sources. I live in an area where we're near the ocean, so people fish. If you can buy fish straight from the ocean that are not frozen and packaged in plastic for weeks or months, that's a great step. But I also think that there is a convenience aspect, and that's not going to be feasible for most of us at scale. So I think there's some easy swaps from the categories of bringing your own cloth bags, which is what I do to the grocery store, not just for the bags I carry the groceries home in, but also produce bags. They now have some great mesh bags that you can use. So those are some easy ones. When it comes to food storage, there's actually now amazing options for both metal and glass storage containers. And also remembering that our grandmothers, or certainly our great grandmothers, managed to do all of this without plastic. So it is possible. It is also just a big job in a world where it's so much more convenient to use plastic. But I try to apply that 80-20 rule in my house as much as possible so that it isn't a source of stress. So things like metal water bottles or glass water bottles, that's an easy swap. The packaging you're using when you store food that you've made in your own home is an easy swap. There now are even a lot of canned goods that are specifically free of a lot of the plastic chemicals, because most people don't realize a lot of cans are lined with BPA or lined with plasticizers to extend the shelf life of those things. But you can get BPA free versions now, or plastic free versions. So making those easy swaps when possible. And then a focus in my home with my kids, even getting on board in the last 5 years or so, has been just paying attention to the fibers of our clothing, and when possible, choosing more natural fibers. I'm really encouraged by this kind of upcoming generation in how aware they are of a lot of this, and how, like, my older kids, for instance, pretty much exclusively shop at secondhand stores because they prefer it, not just from a budget perspective, but because they like the environmental impact of not having to buy new clothes and being able to buy secondhand. But when you do that, you can typically look for cotton or more natural fibers in the clothing that you're buying. And I think the main one to be aware of, there's a lot of the athletic wear that we see is extremely high in different plastic-based chemicals. So just making choices there can be really impactful as well. And like I said, it's in everything. It's in the cords of our lamps. It's in the construction of our home. So it's not something that's really realistic to completely avoid unless we're willing to sort of live totally off grid and build everything from scratch. But I think some of those easy swaps can make a big difference in our day-to-day exposure and reduce it enough that we don't have to be as stressed about it.
So you said glass and steel, and so I'm gonna be upfront here. So I have a stainless steel water bottle. So it's sitting in the stainless steel, but the spout is plastic. And I also have I don't know if you're familiar with Life Factory water bottles, which are pretty much glass. And I just don't like the spout. So I just copped out, and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to use the stainless steel, even though it has the plastic spout. So it's not sitting in the plastic, and the plastic is hard. But would you, still recommend not using a water bottle like this. And I want you to be upfront with me. If you think like, if this were you would you not touch this water bottle because it has the plastic spout?
So my take personally is that I have both options at my house, and most of the time I'll use a metal one that has a metal lid that screws on, so the parts actually touching the water are metal. But I also have a gallon size one that the water bottle is metal, but it does have a silicone spout and like the cap is plastic, the spout is silicone. So at least the part touching the water is silicone. But that one is just much more convenient for when I'm at track meets with the kids or traveling, and I need to have enough water for the whole day. So I think that's, to me, part of the 80/20 is I'm not going to use single-use plastic bottles that are sitting in the sun, which also drastically increases the amount of plastic you're exposed to. But I'm also not willing to get dehydrated to not touch plastic as well. So I think that's one of those balancing acts.
Yeah, and I love to just have a glass of water here, but I'm cautious with the technology and the computer. Just I'm a little bit on the clumsy side, so that's why it's just a convenience. My wife has the stainless steel with the metal top, but just every time she wants a drink out of it, she has to open it. And to me, again, I'm just like I said, it's just copping out because of the convenience. So I figured I'd ask you your opinion. So thank you for sharing that. And then, so just like besides the water, so just the same with food as well, just food, you try to store it in metal and plastic, like in the refrigerator.
Yeah, and there are some great. I can be clumsy as well, but they have these great metal containers that have latch-on lids, which is also really convenient with young kids because if they drop them, which they inevitably will at some point, they bounce instead of break, and the lid doesn't come off. So I have those in varying sizes, all the way up from kind of single-serve meal size for food prep, all the way up to ones that can hold like 2 gallons of soup if I put it back in the fridge. So those are easy swaps, and those are entirely plastic free. There's actually a brand called Life Without Plastic that makes a lot of these. Then I also do some meal prep in glass containers with latch on lids that are either silicone or wood. And those I'll do for if like I'm doing a lot of strength training right now. So if I'm prepping my own food for the week for like breakfast and lunches, I'll do those. But also just to circle back on the hydration, one tip I give people from a habit stacking perspective and a hydration perspective is if you sleep with a glass quart-sized mason jar with water on your nightstand. And I also recommend, I always put trace minerals and silica and a bunch of the stuff that I know I need to get more of in that water. One of my habits is as soon as I wake up, I will drink that water before I drink anything else, because we lose a lot of our hydration actually while we're sleeping. We can lose quite a bit of water just through respiration while we're sleeping. And so getting that water in our bodies first thing in the morning from a glass container, ideally with minerals added in, is an easy way to keep hydration on point for the whole day. And there's been a lot of research around hydration early in the day versus hydration later in the day, not just from a sleep impact perspective of we don't want to drink a ton of water right before bed and be up all night going to the bathroom, but that early morning hydration, because we do get a mild dehydration just during sleep, can be really impactful from an energy level perspective and to help our detox pathways, which I think those are important to be aware of and support if you're trying to get out plastics that are already existing in the body. So I'm a big fan of that, and also sauna use for getting out residual plastic in the body.
Yeah, good tips. Definitely want to stay hydrated. And I love sauna. And of course, you want to especially stay hydrated if you're going to the sauna regularly and take electrolytes. And do you do sauna daily, or is it a few times per week?
A few times per week, for sure. For sure, I go through phases of doing it regularly. When everything shut down for COVID, I actually used that time to do an actual experiment in my neighborhood. We were all sort of locked down together, so I recruited this group of people. We did lab tests before and after. So people may have heard of the studies on sauna, especially the Finnish study is the one that's most quoted, and that's the one that I think really makes a strong case for sauna use. In fact, I say if sauna were a pill, everyone would take it because the effects are really, really profound. We know sauna use in the range of 4 to 7 times per week can reduce all-cause mortality by up to 40%, can reduce risk of dementia, stroke, cancer, heart attack, all of those things pretty drastically because sauna is an exercise mimetic. So you're not going to get the same strength benefits that you would from exercise from doing sauna, but you get a lot of the cardiovascular and mental benefits that you would get from exercise because you are sweating, your heart rate increases, you're moving your lymph system. And so I think if people are able, hitting that 4 to 7 times per week is sort of the gold standard window. And there's some evidence, we saw it as well, of excretion of BPA and plastic chemicals from the body with regular sauna use, with the caveat being that the studies that currently exist have looked at mostly the heat as the mechanism. So there's a lot of people talk about infrared saunas, which I think are awesome. I just always say make sure you're hitting that minimum heat threshold and the minimum time threshold to get the benefits, and then use whatever kind of sauna you can or have available.
Do you know what that heat threshold is?
There's a little bit of variation in what the studies say. I personally aim for 170 degrees or above Fahrenheit. There's some evidence that even in the 150s and above, but there's a time dependent threshold there. So for me, I aim for 170 degrees and up for a minimum of 19 minutes without getting out. So heat exposure, uninterrupted heat exposure for 19 minutes. And sometimes I'll do several cycles of that. But if I'm short on time, that's just my minimum I aim for is 170 and 19 minutes.
Okay, I'm just curious. Do you follow that? What cold shower? A cold shower after that, or?
Sometimes. So the interesting thing about that is I kind of think of them as three separate categories with separate benefits. So sauna use on its own has this whole host of benefits. So does cold exposure, though I think since we have an audience that's potentially thyroid specific, I do think be careful with cold exposure at first if you're working on rehabbing your thyroid, because it can be stressful to the body if you are in a state of thyroid disruption. But then heat and cold together has their own set of benefits, which they call that contrast therapy when you're going back and forth. Now, going from the heat to the cold, it makes it much easier to do the cold, and it's a great relief from the heat. But I try not to get cold exposure every time I sauna, just because I think the isolated benefits of heat and staying in that heat exposure for longer can be really beneficial. I've also lately been experimenting with doing the growth hormone protocol that you might have heard mentioned, where you do 30 minutes of sauna, you cool down a little bit, and you do that 4 times, which is shown to pretty drastically increase human growth hormone. So if you're trying to recover from something, that can be a beneficial tool as well. But I think sauna on its own is also really profoundly beneficial, even if you're just doing sauna.
All right. Well, wonderful. Didn't expect to talk about sauna here, but always love to talk about sauna. So thank you for sharing that. And before we move on to cookware, is there anything else you'd like anything else that needs to be mentioned about the plastics?
I think those are honestly the big categories. And like I mentioned a couple times, I think of a lot of things in my life sort of along the lines of the 80-20 rule, which is the idea that 80% of results come from 20% of inputs in both a positive and a negative context. And so I think anytime we can just find those 20% of things that are actually causing 80% of our exposure, that's a great starting point. And even if that's the only point we ever get to, that's going to be a drastic change for our health. Same thing with when it comes to stress. If you can find your 20% that's causing 80% of your stress and just work on those. Just as a side note, since I didn't say the results of the sauna study, so we lab tested before and after, and there was only in a 2-month period, there was a really drastic reduction in inflammatory markers in the body. There was beneficial movement in all the labs related to inflammation, to hormones, and to sleep. So I think sauna can be really profound there, but I also don't think sauna is necessary for health either. I know sauna is not always budget friendly, so I don't want people to think they can't be healthy without sauna, but I think really just applying that 80-20 rule to plastic exposure, to any sort of health exposure. And I know we're going to talk about the personal care side as well, but that was sort of my driving force with creating those particular products, is what are the 20% of products that are giving us 80% of exposure to toxic compounds in the personal care products that we're interacting with. Same thing with just, I look at that as dietary approach in general, is we don't have to be 100% perfect, but if we can be dialed in the things that are making the biggest impact, we have a lot more leeway in the other areas.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the 80-20 rule, just because I tell patients as well that, and as well as non-patients, that if you're getting exposed to plastic water bottles on an occasional basis, if you're on vacation and just for whatever reason, or on an airplane and you can't bring your own water bottle and you're drinking out of a plastic water bottle, if it's every now and then, not a big deal. You just don't want to be buying water by the case and drinking that every single day. Same argument with tap water. And same thing with the cookware. We're going to talk about the cookware, but if someone goes out to eat, you don't know what cookware they're using. I mean, you could ask, I guess, but chances are you probably won't ask. And as long as you're not going out to eat every single day, if you go out to eat once in a while, not a big deal, it sounds like.
Exactly. And I think you touched on something so valuable, which is just the more of our food we can prepare at home, that makes a huge impact. And it doesn't have to be 100%, but if we can make that a habit as much as possible, which is also great psychologically from a family perspective, there's a lot of studies looking at outcomes in kids in different areas of life just from having dinner together as a family every night, which is a great bonding experience. Hopefully, we're cooking together, so our kids are learning those foundational skills. And then we have a lot more awareness and control over where our food came from and more of a connection with that food. I think steps like that make such a big difference. And I know you would probably echo these steps as well, but I think it's also, like I said, staying in that point of not being stressed out or thinking that everything is out to get us, and dialing in the stuff that's free first, like getting morning sunlight in the morning, because we are so much light dependent, and the thyroid as well. There's a lot of light dependent aspects going into that. So just getting outside for 10 minutes in the morning, not through a window. You don't have to stare at the sun. In fact, please don't, but just be outside getting sunlight. It's a great time to hydrate or get a little gentle movement or spend time with your family. That can make a huge difference in your cortisol, in your melatonin production, in your sleep quality, in other hormones as well, because they all are dependent on those cortisol rhythms. Same thing with if we can dial in our sleep. Anything we can do that improves our sleep has ripples into our wakefulness as well. And then we know stress is a big epidemic. Anything we can do to help with our stress levels will have positive ripples into everything as well. But I also, anytime there's a conversation about health, especially related to thyroid, because that's so personal to me as well, I also just like to remind people that the body's natural state, it wants to move toward good health and toward healing. And I know with autoimmune disease, I for a while felt like my body was out to get me. And I had to realize, like, no, if our bodies wanted to kill us, I think Dr. Cassie Huckabee says this so beautifully. She's like, if your body wanted to kill you, it could do it in less than a second, instantly. Like, it could just instantly kill you. Your body is always on your side. It's adapting, trying to do the best thing for you. So if we can approach it with that mindset of realizing our body, even if there's symptoms of something that we don't like going on in the body, our body's still always on our side. And if we can approach it from the perspective of how do I best support my body in moving toward health and in toward where it already wants to go and what it's already trying to do, like what steps can I give it to help it get there? I think we just come at it with a much more positive mindset than if we're worried that everything is out to kill us.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And thank you for bringing up the sunlight in the morning as well as the sleep. I mean, I think everybody knows the importance of sleep, but the sunlight, I mean, even that's something I've been working on over the years, is trying to get morning sunlight and then also in the middle of the day. Now you live in sunny Florida, so it's probably not that difficult. If someone lives in a, let's say up north or just an area where maybe Seattle, where it's rainy a lot of times during the year, are you okay with like them using a light box or just to get that exposure?
Absolutely. Like, I actually, in the hierarchy, I put light as a very high priority as far as things we can do for health. And I am grateful to now live in an area that gets a lot of sun and good UV throughout the year. So it's something I can integrate pretty easily here. But before I lived here, I did have a bright light, a 10,000 lux light that I used in the morning, that when I started using it, I noticed a difference in my energy levels just because we're so light dependent. And there's even receptors in our eyes that I mentioned that start that whole circadian clock towards sleep, and it's dependent on that early morning light exposure. So my general rule was, as soon as possible after waking, I would get ideally natural light exposure, but if not possible, I would get exposure from those robust light boxes that hit those receptors in the eye that start that clock for melatonin production at night. And that also, because I've done a lot of lab testing over the years as I was recovering, really do make a measurable difference in our stress hormone levels. And I know stress hormones are a big issue for a lot of people in today's society, but they often do overlap with thyroid issues as well, because all hormones are connected and they don't exist in isolation. So if you're only addressing thyroid, but you're not addressing the others as well with some of those free steps, like just get light, I think you're going to be fighting a more uphill battle than if you can prioritize. And I love anytime there's an inexpensive or free step that we can do that has really far-reaching impact for our health. And I think light is one of those. I also think it's a little bit controversial, but I think we've done ourselves a disservice in the last few decades with our fear of light exposure and things like our fear of salt exposure. I think both of those have had pretty negative impacts for health in general, because those are two things our bodies are very dependent on. From a mineral perspective, we need sodium, enough of it for our sodium potassium pump activity to work correctly, for electrical communication within the body. And when everybody, especially those of us who eat a more natural diet, we're not exposed to as much salt from processed foods, which is overall a good thing. But if we're not replacing those minerals from other sources, that can actually really have your energy levels take a dip. And so I think that's another easy one. But I think we got afraid of the sun and we got afraid of natural minerals. And a lot of people are now facing deficiencies in both of those. But like I said, I would put actually light and sun exposure, even though it's controversial, as extremely high up on the list of priorities for supporting health across the board. And so I, like you, I get morning sunlight, and then I try to get 20 or 30 minutes of midday bright light exposure on as much of my skin as possible, with, of course, the caveat that we're never trying to burn. And if we're burning easily, that can actually be an insight that there's inflammation happening somewhere in the body. I also noticed when I changed my diet and was much more careful about what I was eating, that my sun tolerance went up a lot, because my background is Irish Scottish. So I, in high school, would burn if I even thought about looking at the sun. And now that I eat a much more nutrient rich diet and have worked on getting inflammation down, I find that I don't burn, and I'm very careful not to burn, but that I feel great when I get enough sun exposure.
I promise we're going to get to the cookware, but I want to ask you another question with the sun, especially since you have six children. Do you ever use sunscreen? I'm sure if you do, it's a more natural brand, but do you just completely avoid the sunscreen at all?
For the most part, I completely avoid the sunscreen, which, like I said, that's a controversial viewpoint. I very much take the view that we need more sun exposure, not less, with careful care not to burn. So my preference is always to just cover the skin or get in the shade if we've reached our tolerance of the sun for that day. But if they're at a sporting event and they're on the track field and there's no shade, they'll either put on a long sleeve shirt or a hat, or occasionally they'll use a homemade mineral sunscreen just on their face. But I also find my kids, who have lived most of their lives in sunny environments, that our bodies are so adaptable that they have actually developed really good sun tolerance from a young age. And they notice so much. Even, I think kids are so great at this. They notice almost immediately the positive effects of changes they make. And so they notice they feel more energetic when they get good sun exposure. And because it's just so built into our family culture, they're very careful about not burning, but they're also pretty careful about making sure they're outside quite a bit during the day, which is great.
Yeah, especially in this day and age where a lot of children, unfortunately, are just glued to their electronics and not getting enough sun. So that's great, and it's also goes back to what you were saying about the plastics. Like 100 years ago or 80 years ago, they didn't have to worry about the plastics. It's not like 100 years ago everybody was using sunscreen, because I don't know when sunscreen was invented, but for many years there was no sunscreen out there. And so I agree. I'm not saying there's never a time and place, but for the most part, as long as you're careful, not out in the sun for too long, and even if you are covering yourself up, taking the proper precautions, that you'll probably be okay. So yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that, Katie.
Well, and we can mimic some of the aspects of the sun, whether it be with red light or with the light boxes we talked about, or even UV lights, but those all get pretty pricey. And then they're another thing you have to add to your to-do list every day. Whereas I feel like the sun is like the multivitamin of light, and it's free and it's available hopefully to all of us in some form every day. And so I think at least start there, even if you do, for your thyroid, for instance, want to do red light for a while, or you want to increase your UV exposure if you live in a cloudy area. That's great, but I don't think that needs to be the starting point, because, like I said, the sun is free.
All right. So that being said, we're going to go to cookware now. Just I'm sure everybody's been waiting. Again, they've been, I'm sure, learning a lot. Just I didn't expect to talk about sauna and sunlight, but it's important. I mean, that's the thing about this podcast, and I know with yours as well. I just go in whatever direction if something important comes up, and it is important because we tend to overlook some of these factors, getting enough sun, and even neglecting sleep. So again, I appreciate you bringing that up. But definitely want to talk to you about cookware, because that also is what I discovered on your website too. Just your articles talk about safe cookware options, just because there's problems with the aluminum and the different coatings. And I don't know if you want to start off by talking about some of the issues, the problems with like the nonstick pans, and obviously aluminum and other chemicals that are being used.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another area I think we are seeing a lot more awareness about, which is great, because now we have people stepping into the space who are creating healthier alternatives that are also still convenient in a lot of ways. I think we see that curve happen a lot, where new things are created that make life so much more convenient, so they're easily adopted. And then we learn later about the potential downfalls of those things, which is also the case with the nonstick cookware you mentioned, or aluminum. Especially the nonstick is so much easier to cook with for a lot of people. And so it became widely adopted. But people probably have heard of the studies of how the off-gassing from certain cookware can even kill household pets that are birds because they're so sensitive to it. And humans aren't as sensitive that we're going to die from the fumes of it, but there is an impact on humans as well. And again, just to acknowledge the convenience side, I get why people want to use those because it is much more convenient. Cleanup is a lot easier. But now there's a whole category of products that are within the safe category that are also pretty convenient to cook with. And I've experimented with a lot of those over the years. I know my grandmother was pretty much just using cast iron that she had seasoned for decades that was essentially nonstick at that point because she had taken such good care of it. But I think now there's other options as well. I'm a big fan of ceramic, which is not non-stick, but if you cook with it correctly, it doesn't have a high likelihood of sticking, and it's very easy to clean because you can use metal scrubbers to clean it, which is not the case with a lot of other natural cookware. So as long as you're getting a ceramic cookware that doesn't have heavy metals or something in the ceramic coating. So I have a lot of fully ceramic cookware in my house. And then there are also ones like the Always pan that is essentially nonstick, but free of a lot of the compounds that are found in traditional nonstick like Teflon. So there are ones like that that are emerging. But again, if like we talked about, if the movement is more toward cooking at home as much as possible, then cookware is in that category of the 20% we can change that makes a big difference because it's interacting with a lot of our food. So anytime we can use ceramic or glass or safe metals over the aluminum or the nonstick, that's an easy step. And we're already cooking anyway. I'm a big fan of swaps that can be just sort of made without any extra inconvenience. So whether that be natural laundry detergent, concentrates that you can use because you're washing clothes anyway, whether that's cookware that's safe because you're cooking food anyway, whether that's deodorant or shampoo or toothpaste that's safe because you're going to use those products anyway. I'm a big fan of those swaps that don't take any extra bandwidth or decision making once we switch them.
You said the pan was the Always. That was the name of the one of the products.
The Always pan, and there's also a brand called Extrema that makes ceramic as well. And then Caraway is new on the scene that a lot of people are liking because they have bakeware as well. And I can send you resources you can put in the show notes for all of those. But there are thankfully a lot of great alternatives. And I would say stainless steel is a pretty decent alternative if it truly is aluminum free. And that one is widely available and also pretty inexpensive. Or cast iron if you're willing to take care of it, although some people have concerns with getting too much iron from using exclusively cast iron. So that's the one caveat with that one.
Yeah, my wife and I actually, we don't use it all the time, but we use a few times a week cast iron for like we do some grilling, like grilled chicken. What do you use like if you're using as far as like grilling burgers or chicken?
Yeah, usually cast iron or occasionally stainless steel, but cast iron definitely has a better heat ratio and gives a better cook, I think, on a lot of those foods.
And do you use glassware as well?
I do use glassware some. There's even glass pots and pans that you can use. It's harder. The one thing I run into in my house particularly is because there's so many of us, I also have to find cookware that's big. So I love the Always pan, but it's hard to cook for 8 people in one skillet. So that's the one thing I run into. So I use a lot of stainless steel stock pots or ceramic stock pots for bigger meals, which is the majority of our meals at our house.
And for those listening who are wondering what's the big deal with the nonstick, there's definitely some research out there with, especially with Teflon, and when it comes to the thyroid, even there's some research shows that it could have some thyroid disrupting properties, and I'm sure it has other health concerns besides that. So, and just because there are alternatives, as Katie's been sharing with us, it just makes sense that why would you want to? Well, the answer is convenience. That's why people go for it. But again, we use ceramic as well. We use a combination of ceramic, glassware, stainless steel, and then I mentioned the cast iron pots and pans as well. So there's definitely alternatives, and some of it, like the cast iron pots and pans, I don't know if you found a good solution, but it is a little bit difficult cleaning. So, but it's just one of those things where, to me, it's worth the time to scrub to avoid those chemicals.
Well, and one easy mom tip on that is both of those stainless steel and cast iron are both very temperature dependent in the cooking surface and how much they're going to stick. And often a lot of the cleaning issues can be resolved by just waiting to get to the right temperature before you put any food in the pan. And an easy test for that is just to put a couple drops of water in. And if they immediately start dancing, that's a safer temperature. And then using a natural oil when you put food in. But I can even cook eggs often in either of those without any sticking, as long as I have the temperature correct going into it. And then, of course, people probably know with cast iron, but seasoning it carefully, making sure that it always has that natural oil barrier, and not using soaps or anything really harsh to clean it. A lot of people will clean with salt or things like that to not break down that natural seasoning that happens.
So that's what you recommend using salt in order to preserve the.
Yeah, I use salt and a natural scrub brush, and then I always oil it after using it before it dry, or hand dry it and then oil it rather than air dry it so that it doesn't ever get rust. And then I occasionally also season in the oven to keep that barrier strong. And if you take care of it well, a cast iron pan will actually get better with age for that reason.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing that. Do you have an air fryer?
I do have an air fryer. There is one that has a stainless steel insert. It's another one that I don't use as often because it's hard to cook for as many people in an air fryer. So I would end up having to do multiple batches, and I much more often just use my normal stainless steel bakeware in the oven because there's so many of us. But there are a couple good options now for air fryers, and I know those have gotten really popular.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because my older sister was raving about our air fryer, so I looked into them. But a lot of them I didn't realize have the non-stick as well, like I guess the tray that they use for the air fryer. So it sounds like there is one. You said that's stainless steel.
There is one that's stainless steel, and with air fryers and especially pressure cookers, I think that's another one to be just very aware of if you're going to use them, because a lot of them do have nonstick coatings, and especially with pressure cookers at pressure, you're going to see more of the movement of those compounds into the food itself. Like heat and pressure both increase that movement, just like they do with heat or light in the ocean with plastics. So you just want to be aware of those. Anything, the higher the temperature, basically, the more careful you want to be.
All right. Well, awesome. So before we talk about personal care products, anything else when it comes to cookware that you wanted to mention?
I think that's pretty much summed it up. Like I said, I think there are easy swaps that you can find now that are not really much less convenient than the nonstick ones that you'll find everywhere. And I think we're seeing a big movement of people making those choices, which is great because there's often this, it seems like a battle between there's smaller companies that'll rise up to solve a problem that'll eventually get bought by bigger companies. And I know a lot of consumers resist that when a natural company is bought by a bigger company. But I think long term, this is actually a great sign because this means even the big corporations are acknowledging that people want safer products now. And to actually fix these problems at scale, we need the consumers making great choices, and we need these big companies who have economies of scale and who can vote with many more dollars than we do, making those choices as well. So I take it overall as a good sign that we're seeing so many of these companies pop up and that big companies are now acknowledging the importance of them.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And let's talk about personal care products, because I know that's also a huge passion, which is why, as you mentioned earlier, that's why you developed your own product line. So what are some of the concerns? What I think people who are listening, they know the concerns, but I still want to hear the main reasons why you decided to. I mean, first of all, even before that, you had like on your website, just do it yourself recipes. So it's not like just the product line is like the beginning of it. It's for years you've been just promoting just people making their own products, and of course, a lot of people just don't want to do it. They can also make it on their own, but yeah, if you could talk about some of the concerns with the personal care products out there.
Absolutely. And like you said, all those recipes are still on my site, and I'm a huge fan of DIY. So if people who don't even want to buy natural products, I think there's now great DIY recipes for essentially everything available on the internet. But for me, when I was in the thicket of healing from the thyroid issues, I was much more sensitive to essentially everything. So I was on a very restrictive clean diet that I'm thankfully not as restrictive as I was then. But I also was realizing that a lot of the things in my environment were also causing problems at that point. And so I started, at the time, there were not natural alternatives to most things. So I started making them at home, which was everything from toothpaste to deodorant to hair care. Pretty much anything that came in contact with our bodies, I made from scratch so that I would know what was in it, which was fascinating. I actually loved that deep dive into chemistry and understanding how those compounds interacted. And what I learned is, people will say that our skin is our body's largest organ, which I think there's a strong case for that. I would argue that if you want to count muscle as an organ system, muscle might be actually a larger organ, but both are very important. But with skin, a lot of what goes on our body also enters our body. And I think a lot of people think of the skin as a barrier that doesn't let things in. And the skin is a barrier, and a very important one, but it's also meant to uptake things. So things that go on the body do eventually make it into the body, which can be used for positive as well as being aware of the negatives of that. And so that was one thing with DIY products. I started thinking, like, how can I put beneficial ingredients on the things that are on my skin or going in my kids' bodies through their skin, and not just avoid the bad stuff. I think hopefully avoiding the really toxic stuff in skincare should be just the baseline. And I hope for a world one day where companies, that is the standard, not the exception. But understanding that our skin is an organ that interacts with anything put on it, we hopefully become more aware of what we're putting on our bodies or in our mouths, or especially tissue like the armpits, which is very close to our lymphatic system. There have been some studies, they're controversial as well, but about certain products being put on the armpits from deodorants that might leach in, and a higher incidence of breast cancer, for instance, for people who use those products regularly. So I started making these at home and then realized about 10 years later that a lot of people who were eating organic and making all these healthy choices weren't willing to put in the effort to do the DIY, and also that they wanted products to perform a certain way because they were used to an experience with these products. And that women especially weren't willing to trade how their hair looked or felt, or if their teeth were white, for using the more natural products. And so I realized for these friends who were eating organic but still using Pantene and Crest and whatever it was, that the only way they were going to make a change is if there was a convenient, easy swap that they could make with no extra effort. And I also realized, back to the 80-20 principle, that about 20% of the products we use are actually responsible for about 80% of our chemical exposure. And we know statistically, on average, women encounter many more chemicals through personal care products than men do, which anybody who's married and has a bathroom counter can probably tell just from the looking at their bathroom counter and the number of products that the guy has versus the woman has. But this is especially a concern for women. And women also have a higher instance of thyroid issues and all kinds of issues. I think this is one of the contributing factors, certainly not the only one. And so I realized if we could just make swaps in those products that are most impactful, that would go a big part of the way to changing everything. And there are also now natural makeup brands, and you can actually swap out everything if you want to. But I think if you start with the stuff that is on your skin or you're getting exposure to all day, that makes a big difference. Because just like we talked about with the plastics, the things that are in our personal care products are getting integrated into our bodies. They're entering our bloodstream. They're getting integrated in our tissues, and many of them can store in the body for years. And personal care products, just like a lot of plastics, have endocrine disruptors. And so avoiding those products can make a big difference toward health over the long term, because our skin is such a large organ and allows so much to go through it. So that was really the impetus for creating those products. I also started with the ones I started with for that exact reason, because obviously oral care products are in our mouth, so people can acknowledge that those go into the body pretty rapidly. There's even medication that you just hold under your tongue, and it's very effective because the body can uptake so rapidly from the mouth. I've been fascinated by oral health ever since I read Weston A. Price's book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, over 10 years ago now, and just realizing not only do we have an oral microbiome, but there's this whole living, amazing process happening within our mouths with remineralization and the interaction of our saliva and fat soluble vitamins within the body, and the rebuilding, the constant rebuilding of the enamel of the teeth. And so creating products that supported that natural process, again, back to that idea that your body's always on your side. So if something is going wrong, what's missing, or what does the body need in order for that process to go right? So I started with oral care and hair care, because hair is also one where we think if we just wash our hair, we wash it out and we're done. But really what's happening is we are getting the direct exposure to those products while we're washing our hair, but then not all of it is removed from the hair follicle. So we're also getting low level exposure to whatever that is throughout the whole day through skin contact and also through respiration. So any of those really strong smelling scents or perfumes, we're inhaling those and getting low level SVOC exposure all day long. So we're getting a kind of a dual exposure, which is also something to be aware of with, for instance, laundry products. If your laundry products smell like air fresheners, that those compounds are sitting on your skin through your clothing, and you're inhaling them all day, every day, even while you're sleeping, if you're wearing pajamas or you have sheets that were washed in those. So making swaps there can be a big impactful change as well. And then same thing, like I mentioned with the deodorant, that being such a tissue where so much lymphatic activity is happening in the armpits. If you have chemicals sitting there all day, the body's uptaking them, and those can then circulate throughout the body. So I realized if I could replace those products that most people use every single day with oral care, hair care, and deodorant, that would go a lot of the way toward removing some of at least the more dangerous and more widespread exposures that we all have.
So you have your own line of toothpaste, shampoo, and Already. Oh, the deodorant, and then also you have soap as well, and then hand sanitizer.
Soap and hand sanitizer, and now floss as well, that
Oh yeah, that's right.
biodegradable
Yeah, yeah.
flossers,
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
most floss is actually lined with some of the more nasty plastic compounds to make it glide so easily. And then those are sitting in the gums. And I think being really especially aware of what goes into our mouth is a big, big problem. Also, like fluoride is another controversial topic in and of itself, but there's a lot more that goes into oral care than just that. So I know you've probably talked about the fluoride thyroid connection and how we want to be aware of fluoride because it can interfere with thyroid hormone. And so I think most people, when it comes to toothpaste that are aware of that, just choose fluoride free alternatives, which is really helpful. And there are not now compounds like the one we use called hydroxyapatite, which is what's naturally present in tooth enamel to begin with and what our body's using to rebuild tooth enamel all the time. But there's also a really diverse oral microbiome that is actually the start of the digestive process and that is really involved in whether or not we get cavities or gum disease. So there's two kinds of imbalance that can happen within the mouth. In one direction, you're going to get the strep mutans bacteria, which is the one that's responsible for cavities, but you also might see other imbalances that lead to gingivitis. And the interesting part is you don't typically see those happen at the same time, because just like in the gut microbiome, there's an oral microbiome that's always trying to keep the bad bacteria in check, and that will usually only one of those opportunistic bacteria at a time will spike. But understanding that if we can support the oral microbiome and support our good bacteria in our mouth, not only does that help with things like bad breath, which people are concerned about, and help with remineralization, it also can help keep both of those more opportunistic and dangerous bacteria in check as well. So I love getting to talk about the oral microbiome and how to support that. And just like with the hair care products, my goal was not just to avoid the bad stuff. It was an absolute mandatory for me that all the products had only EWG safe ingredients, but also to look at knowing that these things are going to enter the body in a bigger way. How can we put things that are beneficial to the oral microbiome or to the skin microbiome or to the proper functioning of a hair follicle? How can we put those things into the products so that we're actually getting a beneficial effect all day long versus a negative one?
Is it the same with the soap too? Do you have ingredients too that help like nourish the skin?
Exactly. Yeah. And in the hair care, for instance, we have ones that naturally help increase hair follicle activity. I know hair loss is a big concern for people, especially thyroid. I had hair loss for a while. And so I was looking at how can I basically create a multivitamin for the skin, for the hair, for the oral microbiome that's going to give it a benefit all day long.
Yeah, that's awesome. And getting back to the toothpaste, so the hydroxyapatite that it helps to, so it's not only that it's fluoride free, but it also helps support the oral microbiome. And then also, if I understand correctly, helps with potentially the remineralization of the teeth as well.
Exactly. That was the goal, especially with the toothpaste. And it's the one I DIY'd earliest, and it's been through almost 100 iterations to get to this current version that I love. But it uses hydroxyapatite, which is also what makes teeth look white. And I know a lot of people prefer their teeth to look white and shiny. And hydroxyapatite, when you strengthen that tooth enamel naturally over time, is also what contributes to your teeth looking white and looking healthy. But it's because it's supporting that natural remineralization process by providing that hydroxyapatite and the minerals that the body needs to interact with your saliva to constantly replenish your tooth enamel.
All right. Well, wonderful. And you could check out Katie's line. It's called Wellness with an E at the end, wellness.com. And yeah, definitely highly recommend checking our products out. And anything else? Did we pretty much did you pretty much cover everything you wanted to with regards to personal care products?
Yeah, I think so. I'm glad we got to go in so many far-reaching directions, and I think I love the work you're doing and all these topics that you're tackling that are, I think, so important for all of us, but especially for moms who has been the my audience and community for so many years. And I love that the work you're doing is supporting families and helping all of us as well.
Well, thank you so much. And I just wanted to finish up. If you, being that you at one time experienced thyroid autoimmunity, Hashimoto's, if you could just finish by maybe giving some additional tips for those with thyroid autoimmunity, like things that maybe you've done over the years to maintain your health. You did mention a lot here with the sauna and the sunlight and the sleep. So I don't know if there's anything else to add, but if there is, definitely would love to hear it.
Yeah, I think thyroid especially is a place where I think very much like we talked about in the very beginning, we see the best outcomes when we have informed patients who are willing to do the research and make the daily choices and can benefit from the knowledge of amazing practitioners who have specific knowledge that can be helpful, because the thyroid is so far reaching in its impact in the body. And there are so many inputs that can lead to an imbalance. So it's not that there's ever a single cause and effect, one thing that's going to fix the thyroid. And because, like we talked about, all hormones are so interconnected that I often think the thyroid having an issue is often a symptom of something happening wider in the body. And we can't just try to fix the thyroid, but it's a great sign from the body. The body's trying to tell us something important, to look at all these other things as well. And I think when we take that holistic approach, it's really more impactful and hopefully a quicker healing than if we just try to treat the thyroid in isolation, for instance. And I think it also leads into a little bit of a conversation around mindset, which was actually much more impactful for me than I expected it to be, because for many years I had that view, like I mentioned, of that my body was out to get me and it was attacking me and it was trying to kill me. And I realized eventually that that mindset piece and the languaging I was using toward myself also made a big difference in how I was approaching healing and how that process was going to look. And so I don't think that mindset alone necessarily is going to fix the problem, but I do think it's an important piece to be aware of. And I think, like I said, shifting to that idea that our body is always on our side, and coming from the approach of how do I best support my body and being my partner in achieving better health, which I think also leads to what could be many, many podcasts all on its own, but about the stress side and addressing if we have unresolved issues or trauma that's going on. That was part of it for me as well. But also just shifting that mindset to a positive approach versus a negative approach, and not restricting food because it's bad, but choosing great food because we love and respect and want to nourish our bodies, and taking that positive approach of working with our bodies in the best way possible to nourish ourselves and to work toward what the body already wants, which is healing. I think that mindset piece just opens the door and sheds light on a lot of the areas that we can work on, and also in a way that makes it exciting and fun versus restrictive and feel like a prison. So I always want to leave people with that, and hopefully just that mindset of working to a place of less stress and more self-love. It puts us in a better mental state for healing as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And I agree. You mentioned that mindset alone usually won't be enough. And I agree with that as well. But I will say that when I work with people, that those who have a more positive mindset do seem to get better results than with a more negative mindset. I mean, thankfully, most people I work with do seem to have that positive mindset. But for those few people who have the negative mindset, it doesn't mean that they can't heal. It just does seem like it makes a difference. So I appreciate you sharing that. And can you remind people, Katie, where they could find out more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Wellness Mama everywhere online. The website is wellnessmama.com that hosts the podcast. And there's links to a lot of resources available on there as well. And if people want more specific in any of these categories, it's actually often just easy to Google Wellness Mama and Cookware or Wellness Mama Thyroid, whatever it is, and all the articles on that topic will come up.
Yeah, that's actually how I find you when I wanted to refer to your cookware. I just type in Wellness Mama and type in cookware or Wellness Mama plastic alternative. So yeah, that's a great advice for that. And yeah, definitely if you're one of the rare people who have not checked out Katie's website as well as her Wellness Mama podcast, please do so. And again, Katie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. You covered so much today and I learned a lot and I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a fun conversation.